Assad's end game? What is his goal in this conflict? And it seems that he's even ratcheting it up to be attacking and killing completely innocent civilians now.
Well, I think his end game is just simply survival. This is a guy who's now presiding over the second generation of a dynasty that has controlled the Syrian state. He's not popular. He's not well loved. He's hated by his own people as they're beginning to defect left and right. And so what he's just simply trying to do is to hold on. I think he's holding on against all hope. I do think that ultimately he's got very, very little room to maneuver here, but his endgame is just simply control. This is a Machiavellian struggle that he's engaged in here right now, and he doesn't care how many people will die as a result. 22 or 21,000, depending on who you talk to, souls have perished as a result of this insistence of just simply clinging to power.
So, Jonathan, why hasn't he accepted offers by Russians and others to be spirited out of the country to survive quite well and in luxury if he were to so choose?
Well, first of all, we're not sure exactly what's been offered to him. Last I saw, the Russians denied offering him that kind of asylum. But again, this is a man who sees himself as the leader. He sees himself as the president for life. This is what his father was until he died in 2000. When he was named the president after that, he rose to power in meteoric fashion. He was an eye doctor in London before stepping in as president. He's grown very accustomed to the lifestyle that he leads right now. He's wealthy. He's very powerful. This, I would think to him, at least initially, probably appeared to be more of a nuisance. It's gotten worse. I don't think he's come to grips with reality. That's my assessment here. I think despite the fact that the walls are closing in on him and things are really collapsing, I don't think that he truly understands that once he's captured, this is going to look like Gaddafi here. He's probably not going to live to see the end of this.
Jonathan and Jesse Cupp, I want to talk a little bit about that UN report Buck mentioned earlier. When I read it today, the report today, and saw that both sides had been guilty of war crimes according to this UN investigation, not only did it make me think the UN has spiraled into total uselessness, but also it made me question what the strategy was. What do you think the point there was? Do you think they were trying to keep the heat, the temperature around Syria to an international audience relatively cool by coming out with that kind of verdict?
It's possible. First let me say this, that certainly the truck bombing that we saw this morning, the suicide bombing that we saw several weeks ago, these are war crimes, so there's no question about it. Yeah. They are terrorism, and you have to, despite the fact that this Syrian regime is abhorrent, you have to give them at least that this is terrorism. Nevertheless, I think the UN is completely useless here. It has been for a very long time. The fact that they chose Kofi Annan, who was the guy who presided over the oil for food scandal, he was the guy that presided over the massacres in Srebrenica and Rwanda. The fact that they chose him, I think, shows the lack of seriousness that the UN has had here. They're looking for the least common denominator, and that's not how things are solved. Definitely not in the Middle East, not with any major world conflict. You're not going to get everybody to agree. Both sides are not equally culpable. There is a side that is wrong here. That is the Syrian regime under Bashar al-Assad. Everybody knows that, but yet somehow you've got this UN speak, this Diplo speak, that somehow tries to smooth this over to get the Syrians to possibly come back to the table, or to assuage, for example, the Russians or the Chinese who are still sticking up for Syria on the world stage.
Guys, I want to return to Amy's concept of the end game and see if we can flesh that out for a moment more. What does the end game look like? I think we commonly tend to think of it as an all-or-nothing affair. Either Assad ends up at the end of a rope, or he ferrets out the entire Free Syrian Army in entire opposition from what we know of as Syrian borders. But we've discussed this before. Isn't it a possibility that the end game is that Assad carves up Syria? He finds his home turf somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, and something we know of as Syria today is no longer what we see a year from now. Assad is still in power of some section of that country with some, I'm sure, ethnic monolith behind him. Is it necessarily an all-or-nothing affair? I know Iran's potential involvement would suggest that it is, but is that what we're looking at?
I think it is, and I'll want to ask Jonathan his opinion of that in a second, but I think that what you've seen is, one, he's correct in that Assad does not recognize reality. I think Assad probably thinks he can still win this thing in some capacity. He has not, we've seen a lot of violence, but his father was even more willing to deploy violence to put down an uprising, and Assad, I think, still has some things in his bag of dirty tricks, if you will, that he could try to deploy at some point if his back is really up against the wall. Because if the military leaves him, if he doesn't have that security apparatus at his beck and call, he won't be able to obtain that little sort of carve-out, if you will. He won't actually be able to set up some sort of an enclave. So I think that he recognizes this as it is an all-or-nothing affair as far as I see it. And as long as he has control, at least nominal control, of the security forces and the intelligence apparatus in Syria, he probably thinks he can win. Jonathan, what do you think?
Well, I think you're right, but I think, I would just add this, that first of all, you have to look at the sectarian nature of Syria. You've got Kurds, you've got Alawites, you've got Sunnis, and so, it would, I think, be very natural for the country to break up. But this would be something that every other state in the region would find absolutely horrifying, because the last thing any of these states want to see is things make these divisions sort of shaking out along sectarian lines. That would be a terrible signal, for example, in Iraq. We did everything we could to keep that state together. The last thing we want to signal is that that's okay. And so I think the international community would do a lot to prevent that kind of sectarian breakup and to have some sort of an Alawite little enclave somewhere in Syria. And I think actually that's really what the international community needs to do. We need to, I mean, we've talked about it, it's time to start really putting this into action. We need no-fly zones, we need safe havens, we need other things that will be able to help protect the FSA, particularly as this thing gets uglier and uglier. It's going to fall on the shoulders of the United States, despite the fact that Barack Obama is not interested in this one bit.